The little black girl begged the biker, saying a torn piece of her mom's shirt was found beside a restricted lab. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, the sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. A little girl, no older than 8, ran desperately down the street, her feet pounding the pavement, tears streaming down her face. Her heart raced as she approached a group of bikers who had parked their motorcycles near a small diner. She was out of breath, scared, but determined. As she reached the bikers, she grabbed the sleeve of one of their leather jackets, her small hands trembling. "Please, you have to help me," she cried, her voice shaking. "They took my mom." The bikers looked at each other, confused and alarmed. They weren't used to dealing with this kind of situation, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. One of the bikers, a tall man with a weathered face and a scar across his cheek, kneeled down to her level. "What happened, kid?" he asked gently, his deep voice softening. The girl wiped her tears, trying to catch her breath. "They took my mom. I found a torn piece of her shirt by the lab." The biker's brow furrowed. The word lab immediately caught his attention. There were only a few places in the area where labs were restricted, places that held dangerous secrets. He had no idea how this little girl knew about them, but he wasn't about to let it slide. "Where did this happen?" he asked. She pointed down the road toward an abandoned warehouse. "It was near the old lab. I saw them take her." The biker stood up, signaling to the rest of the group. Without a word, they all began to gather their gear. The situation was already escalating, and they needed to move fast. The little girl had mentioned a torn piece of fabric. That wasn't just a random clue. That was a sign that something terrible had happened. It didn't make sense, but he wasn't going to let her down. She was scared, and she had nowhere else to turn. As the bikers started their engines, the roar of their motorcycles filled the air. The girl climbed onto one of the bikes, holding on tight as they sped off toward the warehouse. She told them to hurry, her voice filled with panic. The bikers didn't hesitate. They knew they had to get to the lab before it was too late. As they reached the outskirts of the warehouse district, the air seemed to grow heavier, more tense. The little girl pointed toward a nondescript building at the end of the street. "That's where they took her," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker with the scar glanced at the others, a sense of urgency growing within him. They weren't just walking into a simple rescue mission. There was something much bigger at play here, and they were about to find out just how deep it went. They approached the building cautiously, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The last thing they needed was to walk into an ambush. The door to the building was slightly ajar. The biker leader motioned for the others to stay quiet and moved toward the entrance, his hand on the handle. He took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. What they found next would change everything. The door creaked open, and the air inside the building smelled damp, stale, and thick with the weight of secrecy. The bikers crept in, their boots barely making a sound against the cracked concrete floor. Their eyes darted around the dimly lit space, scanning every corner for any sign of movement. The girl, still trembling, clung tightly to the biker behind her. She had no idea what they would find inside, but she felt safer now than she had in days. They moved quickly but cautiously, their motorcycles parked just outside, ready to flee at a moment's notice. The building was quiet, almost too quiet, and the silence felt like a warning. The group of bikers, led by the man with the scar on his face, slowly made their way deeper into the building. As they approached a set of heavy metal doors, they could hear muffled voices from behind. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The leader of the group motioned for everyone to stop and listen. The sound of footsteps, the occasional clink of metal, it all seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the building. He signaled for the others to move in closer. "Stay sharp," he muttered. The bikers took their positions, crouching low to the ground as they pushed the doors open. The scene inside was far more shocking than any of them could have imagined. In the center of the room, a woman lay unconscious on a table, her body covered in bruises and cuts. It was clear she had been tortured, and she was barely clinging to life. The bikers exchanged glances, knowing instantly that this was the girl's mother. The girl, still standing by the door, gasped in horror at the sight before her. She ran to her mother, her small hands trembling as she reached out to touch her. "Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, wake up." The woman's breathing was shallow, and her eyes flickered open, though they were barely able to focus. "Baby," she whispered hoarsely, barely audible. "You shouldn't have come here." The biker leader, whose name was Jack, stepped forward, his face a mask of determination. "We're getting you out of here," he said firmly, kneeling beside the woman. The other bikers immediately sprang into action, securing the area and making sure there was no immediate threat. As Jack helped the woman sit up, he noticed the torn piece of fabric the girl had mentioned earlier. It was caught on the edge of the table, and it looked like it had been ripped from her mother's shirt. The very shirt that had been found by the restricted lab. Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just a random attack. This was part of something much bigger. He turned to one of the bikers, a tall man named Vince, who had a reputation for handling situations like this. "Get on the radio, call for backup," Jack ordered. Vince nodded, his expression grim. "We might not be the only ones looking for answers here," he said as he stepped away to make the call. Meanwhile, the rest of the group was securing the room. They had no idea who was behind this, but they knew one thing for sure. They weren't leaving until they got the answers they needed. The girl, still crying softly, clung to her mother, refusing to let go. Jack could see the bond between them, the deep love and the fear that now held them together. "Mom, we're safe now," the girl whispered, though her voice shook with uncertainty. "We're going to be okay." Jack didn't respond right away, but his eyes softened as he watched the two of them. They had a long road ahead of them, and the fight was far from over. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had a chance. As they waited for the backup to arrive, the bikers took turns keeping watch. The building was old, abandoned, and full of hidden corners that could conceal danger at any moment. But Jack wasn't worried. He knew these people. They had his back, and he had theirs. Just then, the sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hallway. They had company, and it wasn't friendly. Jack signaled for everyone to get into position. "Stay quiet," he muttered. "We don't want to fight, but we're not leaving empty-handed." The footsteps grew louder, and Jack's grip tightened around the handle of his motorcycle helmet. He wasn't about to let anyone take what they had fought so hard to protect. The time for talking was over. It was time to act. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Jack's heart raced. He knew the stakes were higher now. Whoever was coming had a lot to answer for, and they were about to find out just how far the bikers would go to keep their promise to this little girl. The door swung open with a creak, and the group of bikers instinctively tensed, their eyes locked on the shadows outside. Jack, the leader, signaled for everyone to stay still. The faint sound of footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to their location. Whoever it was, they weren't being subtle. Jack's hand gripped the handle of his leather jacket tightly, his mind racing. The girl clung to her mother, her face still pale with fear, but a spark of hope was beginning to form in her eyes. This time, they wouldn't be running. They wouldn't be hiding. The bikers had promised they'd protect them, and that was exactly what they intended to do. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Jack took a deep breath. "Ready yourselves?" he whispered. He motioned for Vince to take a position by the window, while Bear stood guard near the back of the room. The room felt smaller, tighter as the tension built. "We can't afford to let anyone escape. We need answers," Jack muttered under his breath. The door creaked again, and a figure stepped into the doorway. It was a man dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the woman lying on the table, barely conscious. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was no random thug. This man was dangerous, and he had a mission. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice low, demanding. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, handing it to Jack. The biker leader took it cautiously, unfurling the note. His eyes scanned it quickly. The note read, "Leave now, or face the consequences." Jack's eyes narrowed as he looked back at the man. The threat was clear. This wasn't just about the girl's mother. This was bigger. Jack crumpled the note in his fist and tossed it aside. "Not a chance," he said firmly. "You don't get to make the rules here." The man's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, Jack thought he might be ready to fight. But instead, the man let out a slow, deliberate breath and took a step back. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," the man warned. "You're in over your head. And you're about to find out how deep this goes," Jack shot back. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're not leaving until we have the answers." The tension in the room was thick, each biker holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The man didn't flinch. "Then you'll never leave," he muttered, before turning and walking back toward the shadows. Jack's eyes followed him, his instincts telling him that this encounter wasn't over yet. He knew they were being watched, that every move they made was being tracked. He turned to Vince and Bear, signaling them to stay alert. "Get her out of here," Jack said to the rest of the group. "Take her to the bikes." Vince and Bear nodded, moving quickly to help the woman, still unconscious but showing signs of life. The little girl refused to leave her mother's side, but Jack gently took her by the shoulder and guided her toward the door. "We're not letting them win," he said softly, "but we need to be smart." The girl nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just want my mom to be okay," she whispered. "We'll make sure of it," Jack assured her, leading her toward the exit. As they stepped outside, the roar of their motorcycles filled the night air. Jack could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. This was far from over. They had just entered a game where the stakes were higher than they could have imagined. The bikers revved their engines, ready for whatever was coming next. Jack looked toward the horizon, knowing that the battle they were about to face would not just be for the woman's life, but for everything they stood for. As the last biker mounted their bike and revved their engine, Jack glanced back at the building. "This isn't just about a mother and daughter anymore," he said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "This is a war, and we're going to fight it." With that, the bikers sped off into the night, leaving behind the danger that loomed inside the building, but knowing that whatever awaited them, they would face it together. The girl, clinging to her mother on the back of the bike, looked up at Jack. She could feel it, too. The fight had just begun. The roar of the motorcycles echoed through the night as Jack and his crew sped down the deserted highway, leaving the danger behind them, but knowing that they hadn't escaped it just yet. The wind whipped through their hair, and the cool air stung their faces, but no one flinched. Their mission was clear, and they were ready for whatever came next. The little girl, still clutching tightly to her mother, looked around at the riders. She had never been on a motorcycle before, and though the speed and the power of the bikes terrified her, she felt an odd sense of security. For the first time in days, she felt like someone had her back. Jack, the biker leader, glanced over at Vince, his second in command, who was riding beside him. The look in Vince's eyes told Jack that they were both thinking the same thing. This wasn't just about saving a woman. This was about taking down an entire operation that had been lurking in the shadows for far too long. The biker gang had always been a family, bound together by loyalty and respect. But now, they were about to go up against something far bigger than any of them had ever imagined. The little girl's cries still echoed in Jack's mind. Her words haunted him. "They took my mom. They took her to the lab." The lab. Those words kept ringing in his ears. What kind of place was this? What had they done to her mother? And what were they still doing? Jack shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. Right now, the priority was getting to safety, getting answers. They had to figure out who was behind this, and why. The bikers took an unexpected turn off the main highway, heading toward an old, rundown warehouse on the edge of town. It was the perfect place to lay low, to plan their next move. As they pulled into the dimly lit lot, Jack killed the engine and jumped off his bike. Vince and the others followed suit. The woman was still unconscious, but her breathing had steadied, and the girl refused to leave her side. They parked the bikes around the perimeter, forming a protective circle. No one was getting in without them knowing. Jack turned to his crew. "We've got to find out who we're dealing with here," he said. "This goes beyond just the two of them. We're up against something big, something dangerous." Bear, the massive biker with a scar across his cheek, nodded. "We'll get the information we need. Nobody hurts our family." The group moved quickly, setting up a makeshift camp near the warehouse. They set up watch, with everyone taking turns keeping an eye on the surroundings. Jack sat down on a crate, staring at the flickering lights of the warehouse. The sound of his team moving around him was almost comforting, despite the tense situation. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, But he wasn't backing down. As he sat, the girl approached him cautiously. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were wide with fear. "Do you think we'll ever see my mom okay again?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Jack sighed and looked at her, his expression softening. "We're going to make sure she's okay," he said, his voice firm, yet gentle. "And we're going to make sure no one hurts anyone else again." The girl nodded, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. Jack couldn't blame her. The things they were up against were far beyond what any of them could have prepared for. He stood up, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. "Vince, Bear, get on the radio. Let's find out what we're really up against." Vince nodded, pulling out a small walkie-talkie. As he started to make calls, Jack paced the perimeter, his mind racing. Something wasn't right. Why would a group like this, dangerous and powerful, be after a single woman and her child? It didn't add up. And then there was the lab. It wasn't just a research facility. It was a place where things went wrong, where people disappeared, and no one ever talked about it. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Vince's voice on the radio. "We've got a lead. One of the bikers from a different crew has information. Says there's a meeting tomorrow night, and it involves the same people we're after." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" he asked, his voice steady. "It's at an old mansion outside of town. I'll send the coordinates," Vince replied. Jack nodded, turning to the others. "We leave at dawn," he said. "This is our chance to get to the bottom of this." The bikers began to gather their things, preparing for the next phase of the mission. The little girl, clutching her mother's hand, sat quietly in the corner, watching them. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she trusted the bikers. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Jack looked at the girl one last time before heading out to his bike. He could see the fear still in her eyes, but there was also a flicker of hope. They would get to the bottom of this. They would make sure her mother was safe, and they would take down the people who had put them all in danger. The road ahead was long, and the stakes were high, but the bikers were ready for whatever came their way. The first light of dawn broke across the horizon as the bikers gathered around their bikes, preparing for the mission ahead. The cool morning air hit Jack's face as he pulled on his leather jacket. The little girl, her eyes still filled with fear, stood beside her mother, who was finally starting to regain some strength after the horrific events of the past few days. The woman, though weak, managed a small smile at her daughter, trying to reassure her. "We're going to get through this," Jack said softly to the girl, his voice calm but firm. "We're not going to stop until your mom is safe." The girl looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes still searching for answers, but she nodded. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the sound of the engines roaring to life as the group prepared to hit the road. They knew the stakes were higher than ever. Vince, the second in command, leaned over to Jack, his voice low. "We have the coordinates. The mansion's about an hour from here. It's heavily guarded. We should be ready for anything." Jack nodded, glancing at his crew. They had faced many challenges before, but this was different. This was personal. They weren't just fighting for a stranger's safety anymore. They were fighting for family. As they rolled out of the parking lot and onto the highway, the sun began to rise higher, casting long shadows across the road. The group of bikers moved in a tight formation, their engines roaring in unison. Jack's mind raced as they approached the mansion. What kind of place would it be? A mansion hidden away, surrounded by a network of roads and woods, far from the prying eyes of the city. It seemed like the perfect place to hide secrets. The air was thick with tension as the bikers made their way down the long road leading to the mansion. "We stick to the plan," Jack said, his voice steady but determined. "We get in, find the answers, and get out. No heroes, no unnecessary risks." The crew nodded in agreement, their faces serious. The mansion came into view, a large, foreboding structure that looked like something out of a movie. The iron gates were high and sturdy, flanked by tall trees that seemed to close in around the building. It was the kind of place that felt wrong just by looking at it. Jack signaled for the group to slow down as they approached the gates. He could see guards patrolling the perimeter, their figures casting long shadows across the grounds. It wasn't just the mansion itself that made him uneasy. It was the sense that they were being watched. They needed to be smart. Jack motioned for Vince to take a position near the rear, while Bear and the others positioned themselves by the sides. They would need to move quickly, and every second counted. "Everyone ready?" Jack asked, his voice low. The crew nodded, the sound of their engines humming in unison. "Let's move." As they dismounted and made their way toward the back entrance, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. They were close now. Whatever they were about to face, they couldn't turn back. The first obstacle was a guard standing near the rear door, his back to them. Jack signaled to Bear, who moved silently into position, ready to take the guard out quietly. With a quick motion, Bear knocked the man unconscious, dragging him into the shadows. The team moved quickly, entering the mansion's back door. Inside, the mansion was cold and eerily quiet, the only sound being the echo of their footsteps on the marble floors. Jack led the way, moving cautiously through the dimly lit hallways. The air was thick with the smell of dust and neglect, and the silence was oppressive. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a set of double doors, their frames ornate and imposing. Jack knew this was it. They had found the heart of the operation. The doors were locked, but it didn't take long for Vince to force them open. As they stepped inside, they were met with a sight that left them breathless. In the center of the room was a large table, covered with papers, blueprints, and what appeared to be files. The walls were lined with cabinets filled with equipment, and the faint hum of machinery could be heard in the background. This was a lab, but it wasn't just any lab. This place was far more sinister. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just illegal. It was dangerous. What the hell is all this? Bear muttered under his breath as he began scanning the papers. Looks like some kind of research, Vince said, his voice grim. But it's not just any research. This is about control, manipulation, and power. Jack's eyes narrowed as he walked toward the table, his hand brushing over the files. He could see names, dates, and locations scribbled on the papers, some of which were too blurry to read. But one thing was clear. Whoever was running this operation had been planning something big. We need to find out who's behind this, Jack said, his voice low but filled with determination. And we need to stop them. As the bikers continued to search the room, they realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The truth was more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far, and they weren't going to stop until they brought down whoever was behind this. The little girl, still holding on to her mother, looked up at Jack, her eyes wide with fear, but also with hope. They were close now. The fight was just beginning. The room was tense with the weight of what they had uncovered. The flickering light above their heads seemed to echo the urgency in Jack's chest. The bikers spread out, moving quickly through the lab, scanning every paper, every machine, trying to piece together what exactly had been happening here. The papers on the table were covered with complex research, detailed blueprints, and photos of people Jack had never seen before, but their faces all carried a cold, calculating look. Vince picked up a folder and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. This isn't just about human experimentation, he muttered under his breath. It's a full-blown operation. These people have been tracking something, or someone, for months. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. What kind of operation? He asked, his voice low but demanding. Vince handed him the folder, and Jack's eyes scanned the pages. There were names, locations, and coordinates, but it wasn't until he turned to the last page that he saw it. The name of the lab, marked with bold letters, Project 48. His blood ran cold. Project 48? What the hell is this? He slammed the folder down on the table, drawing the attention of the rest of the crew. Bear, who had been going through a stack of photos, looked up. I've seen this before. The lab, the name. A few years ago, there were rumors about a project involving enhanced human abilities, testing on kids. They said it was shut down after a few incidents. But this looks like it never stopped. Jack felt his anger rising, and he turned to the others. We need answers. Now. The group continued to sift through the documents, but the pieces were coming together too slowly for Jack's liking. They needed to find out who was running this, and they needed to stop them. Fast. As the bikers prepared to leave the lab, Jack signaled to Vince. Get the trucks ready. We're taking everything we found here. No one's getting away with this. Vince nodded and moved quickly to gather the papers, stuffing them into his bag. But just as they were about to leave, they heard it. The sound of a helicopter in the distance. It wasn't long before the noise grew louder, and Jack's gut twisted. They're coming. We need to move now. The group rushed to the back exit, their boots thundering on the floor as they ran. The little girl, still holding her mother's hand, looked up at Jack, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could sense the danger in the air. "What's happening? Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack knelt down, his face softening for a moment. "We're going to keep you and your mom safe," he promised, standing up quickly. "Stay close, and don't look back." They made their way through the back alley, avoiding the front gates of the mansion, but the sound of helicopters grew closer. Jack's heart raced. They had to get out of there before they were cornered. Bear led the way, moving swiftly through the shadows. As they reached the edge of the property, they saw it. Two black SUVs waiting at the far end of the street, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "We've got company," Vince said, his voice low. "They're not going to let us leave." Jack's jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice. We have to fight." He motioned for the bikers to take cover as they neared the cars. The helicopters hovered above them now, the lights from the searchlights blinding as they scanned the ground. The bikers were ready, and they knew that. If they didn't fight, they would be caught. The fight for survival had officially begun. The first SUV sped toward them, the sound of its tires screeching against the pavement. Jack dove behind a dumpster, his fingers tightening around his motorcycle handlebar. "Cover the girl and her mom," he shouted to Bear. Bear nodded, his massive frame already moving to shield the woman and child as they huddled behind a nearby car. Jack could hear the sound of footsteps rushing toward them, followed by a burst of gunfire. The bikers returned fire, their shots echoing in the night. Jack's heart pounded as he took aim at the men who were advancing toward them. This was no longer just a rescue mission. This was a war. The gunfire intensified as more vehicles pulled up, blocking the street. "We need to get to the bikes," Jack shouted. The bikers sprinted toward their motorcycles, guns still firing as they moved. Jack's eyes were focused on the girl and her mother. He couldn't lose them. They had come too far. As they reached the bikes, Jack could hear the sound of footsteps coming from behind. "Go," he yelled, kicking his bike into gear. The group raced off into the night, the roar of their engines shaking the street as they sped towards safety. But Jack knew that this was far from over. The fight had only just begun, and no matter what it took, he wasn't going to let them take the little girl or her mother. Not now. Not ever. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance as Jack and his crew sped down the highway, hearts racing with adrenaline. They had just narrowly escaped the ambush at the mansion, but they knew it wasn't over. It wasn't even close. The group of bikers moved in a tight formation, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves on the hunt. The little girl and her mother were safely tucked away behind Jack, clinging to him for safety, though the fear in their eyes hadn't quite disappeared. Jack's mind raced as they neared the next destination, an old, forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place known to a few, a place where deals went down in the dead of night, away from the eyes of law enforcement. And Jack knew that the answers they sought were there. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Jack signaled for the bikers to stop. They parked their motorcycles strategically, making sure they had a clear escape route if things went south. "Stay close," Jack instructed the girl's mother, his voice firm but comforting. He turned to his crew. "We're going in, but we need to be quick. No mistakes." Vince, Bear, and the others nodded, their faces grim. Everyone knew the stakes. If they didn't find the person behind Project 48, the girl's mother might not make it out alive. The group moved quietly toward the warehouse, staying in the shadows to avoid being seen. Jack led the way, his hand resting on the handle of his gun, ready for whatever they would face. They reached the heavy metal door and paused. Jack signaled to Vince, who stepped forward to inspect the lock. "It's old, but sturdy," Vince whispered. "Should be able to get it open." After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of rust and oil filled the air. The sound of their boots on the concrete floor echoed through the empty space as they moved deeper inside. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of machinery. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He knew they were getting closer to the heart of the operation. The stakes were higher than ever. They couldn't afford to waste time. They had to find out who was running this twisted experiment and shut it down. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Jack spotted a set of metal stairs leading to a catwalk above. Without a word, he signaled for Vince and Bear to follow. The rest of the bikers stayed behind, watching the entrance. They moved up the stairs, their steps cautious but steady. At the top of the catwalk, Jack paused, his eyes scanning the dark room below. It was then that he saw it. A group of men gathered around a table, their voices muffled but growing louder. Jack motioned for the others to stay low. They crept closer, careful not to make a sound. "We need to move quickly," Jack whispered. Vince nodded, his face set with determination. They had come too far to back down now. As they reached the edge of the catwalk, Jack could make out their conversation. "We need to speed up the process," one of the men said, his voice gruff. "The higher-ups are expecting results, and we're running out of time." Another man, wearing a lab coat, spoke up. "The children are ready for phase 2. We can proceed as planned." Jack's blood ran cold. Children? He felt a surge of rage building inside him. This wasn't just some covert operation. This was something far darker, something that needed to be stopped. He turned to Vince and Bear. "We need to take them out now," he muttered. "We can't let this go any further." With one swift motion, Jack jumped down from the catwalk, landing in a crouch. The others followed quickly, and in a flash, the bikers were on the men below, taking them by surprise. The fight was fast and brutal. The bikers were trained in the art of combat, and they knew how to handle themselves in a situation like this. Within minutes, the men were subdued, lying on the cold concrete floor. Jack stood over them, breathing heavily. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything. But now, there was no time for questions. They needed answers. "Who's behind this?" Jack demanded, looking at the man in the lab coat. The man's eyes flickered with fear, but he said nothing. Jack's patience was wearing thin. He stepped forward, his gaze cold. "Talk. Now." The man's lip trembled, and he finally spoke. "You don't understand. It's bigger than you think." Before he could finish, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the warehouse. The sound of sirens grew louder. They were coming. "We've got company," Vince shouted. "We need to get out of here now." Jack nodded. "Take him with us," he said, gesturing to the man. "He's our ticket to finding out who's really behind this." The bikers quickly secured the man and started moving toward the exit. The sound of approaching vehicles and flashing lights told them that time was running out. They couldn't stay here. They had to keep moving. As they ran toward their bikes, Jack's mind was focused. They had learned a lot tonight, but the real fight was just beginning. Whoever was behind Project 48 had no idea what they were up against. Jack was ready to bring them down, no matter what it took. The loud hum of engines filled the night air as the bikers sped through. The winding roads, the lights of their motorcycles cutting through the darkness. Jack's mind raced with everything they had uncovered so far. The mysterious lab, the experiments, the sinister purpose behind everything. It was all coming into focus, but there were still too many unanswered questions. The man they had captured had barely spoken, and the more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that they couldn't trust him. He wasn't the one pulling the strings. They had to go higher. They had to find the real mastermind behind Project 48. Jack looked over at the woman and her daughter, still shaken but determined. The girl, clutching her mother's hand, stared out at the road, her eyes distant. Jack felt a pang of guilt. He had promised to keep them safe, but the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. He couldn't fail them now. "We need to find out where they're holding the rest of the kids," Jack said, breaking the silence. "There's no way they've stopped. Whatever they were doing, they haven't just given up." Vince, riding next to him, nodded. "I agree. We need more intel. But the man we grabbed, he's not going to give us much. If anything, he'll only lead us to more people like him." Jack gripped the handlebars of his bike, his knuckles white. He had been in situations like this before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, and there was no turning back. They had to move fast. As they approached a clearing, Jack saw the outline of a building in the distance. It looked like a small cabin, tucked away in the trees, far from the main road. "We're stopping there," Jack ordered. "Get the man out of the van and keep an eye on him." The bikers slowed down, parking their bikes around the cabin in a defensive position. Jack dismounted and turned to the others. "Vince, Bear, stay with the man. I'll go in and check it out." Vince nodded and motioned for Bear to follow him. Jack made his way to the cabin, his senses on high alert. The place was quiet, too quiet. He pushed the door open slowly, the old wood creaking under his weight. Inside, the cabin was dark, but Jack's eyes quickly adjusted. He saw a table covered with maps, photos, and notes. He approached cautiously, scanning. The documents spread out before him. His breath caught as he saw the words Project 48 written on several papers. It was more than he had hoped for. They were getting closer, but there was still so much left to uncover. Jack's fingers traced the names and locations on the maps. There were dozens of marked sites, hidden throughout the country. This was bigger than just a few experiments. This was a nationwide operation. Jack's mind raced as he began to piece together the network they were up against. The more he looked, the more he realized that the people behind Project 48 weren't just playing around. They were dangerous, and they had resources that Jack couldn't even begin to understand. The door behind him suddenly creaked open, and Jack spun around, his hand on his gun. Vince stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "We've got trouble," he said, his voice low. Jack's heart sank. He could already hear the sound of engines in the distance. "How many?" Jack asked, his voice steady. "At least a dozen, coming fast," Vince replied. "They're coming for us." Jack's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. Not with everything they had learned. The bikers needed to get out, and they needed to move now. "Let's go," Jack said, turning to grab the papers from the table. He stuffed them into his jacket and motioned for Vince and Bear to follow him. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, the engines getting closer. They didn't have much time. As they made their way back to the bikes, Jack's mind raced through their options. They couldn't fight off a dozen men in the open. But they weren't alone. They had each other. And they had speed. Jack nodded to his crew as they mounted their bikes. "Stay close. Keep the formation tight," he said, his voice calm but commanding. The bikers revved their engines, ready to make their escape. As they sped off into the night, Jack's thoughts were clear. They needed to find the heart of Project 48, and they needed to shut it down. There was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and Jack wasn't going to stop until he found it. The bikers pushed their bikes harder, racing down the winding roads. They were being pursued, but Jack knew they could outrun them. The wind rushed through his hair, the thrill of the chase mixing with the weight of what they had uncovered. They weren't just fighting for the woman and her daughter anymore. They were fighting for every child who had been caught up in this twisted experiment. Jack's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let anyone else fall victim to Project 48. As the group approached a fork in the road, Jack made a sharp turn to the left, leading them down a narrow trail that cut through the forest. The sound of engines behind them faded, and for a moment, it felt like they had lost their pursuers. But Jack knew better. They had to keep moving, keep the pressure on. They couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. As they reached a clearing, Jack pulled over and looked back at his crew. "We've made it for now," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Vince, Bear, and the others nodded. The fight was just beginning. And they were ready. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the dense forest as Jack and his crew pushed their bikes deeper into the woods. The sounds of the helicopters and their pursuers had faded, but Jack knew they were not in the clear yet. The mission was far from over. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure the girl and her mother were still with them, keeping close. The little girl, though exhausted, was still holding on to her mother's hand tightly. Jack could see the worry in the woman's eyes. She was grateful for the protection but terrified about what might come next. "We need to find out who's behind all of this," Jack said, his voice low as he focused on the road ahead. "I'm sure this is bigger than just one lab. We're up against something massive, and we can't stop now." Vince, riding beside him, nodded. "We've got the papers, but they're just the beginning. We need to hit the headquarters, find the central point where everything connects." Jack didn't respond at first. The plan was risky, but they had no other choice. They couldn't let this operation continue. No one else would. The team had just uncovered part of the truth, but it was only a fragment. They needed to follow the trail, even if it led them into deeper danger. They rode on in silence. For several minutes, the roar of their engines the only sound in the forest. The trees loomed tall, dark, and intimidating, as if they were hiding the secrets the bikers were about to uncover. The last thing Jack wanted was for the girl to see more violence or destruction, but he couldn't protect her from the truth any longer. They were already in too deep. "What's our next move, Jack?" Bear asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Jack didn't hesitate. "We head to the old mill. It's not far from here. It's where we're going to get the answers we need." Vince raised an eyebrow. "The mill? Are you sure? That place is a ghost town." Jack's gaze was steely, unwavering. "That's exactly why it's the perfect place. No one expects us to go there." The crew didn't argue. They trusted Jack's instincts. The mill had been abandoned for years, but Jack knew that the people behind Project 48 would use a place like that to hide their operations. It was perfect for their needs. As they neared the mill, Jack's heart began to race. This was the moment they had been building toward, and every fiber of his being was on high alert. He could feel the weight of the past days pushing down on him. This was it. They were about to uncover the full scope of the operation. Jack signaled for the group to stop. They parked their bikes in a secluded area, out of sight from the road. Stay low, Jack instructed. We move quickly, quietly. Get in, get the intel, and get out. They approached the mill carefully, sticking to the shadows. The structure loomed in the distance, a decaying relic of the past. Its once strong frame had started to rot, the roof sagging in places. But there was something about it that made Jack's gut churn. The place felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they reached the entrance, Jack felt a sense of unease wash over him. He knew they weren't alone. They had been followed. But by who? And how long had they been watched? The door to the mill creaked open as Jack pushed it gently, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, but Jack's eyes quickly adjusted to the darkness. They had barely made it through the door when they heard it, a sharp sound of metal scraping against the floor. Jack's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. Stay quiet, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The rest of the crew nodded. They all understood the danger. They weren't the only ones here, and they had just walked right into a trap. Jack motioned for Vince to go ahead, and the group moved in a line, stepping carefully through the shadows. Every noise was amplified in the silence, and Jack's heart hammered in his chest. They moved past rusted machinery, old crates, and broken windows, their boots making barely a sound. But as they moved deeper into the mill, the temperature in the air seemed to shift, becoming colder, heavier. The deeper they went, the more they could feel the presence of whoever was watching them. I don't like this, Bear muttered, his voice barely audible. Jack shot him a look, signaling him to stay silent. They reached a large room in the center of the mill, and that's when they saw it. A large metal door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar. Jack motioned for the group to stop, and he crept forward alone, his eyes scanning the room. The tension was suffocating. Whoever was inside the mill was close, and they had to be ready. Jack slowly pushed the door open, the creaking of the hinges almost deafening. Inside, the sight took his breath away. There were rows of cages, each holding a child. The children looked like they had been there for days, disheveled, dirty, and wide-eyed with fear. The sight of them sent a surge of anger through Jack's veins. This was what they had been up against. This was what Project 48 was really about. We have to get them out of here, Vince said, his voice low but filled with urgency. Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. We'll get them out, but we need to move fast. The fight was just beginning. The bikers weren't leaving until every child was safe and the people behind this operation were brought down. The room was filled with the sound of muffled cries as the group of bikers stood at the entrance of the cage-filled chamber. The children, barely more than shadows of their former selves, sat huddled in the corners of the cages, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Jack's heart tightened at the sight. This was why they had come, why they had risked everything. They had to stop this operation, no matter the cost. Jack's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but he held himself back. The children's safety was the priority now. We're going to get you out of here, Jack said, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. Stay close, stay quiet. We'll get you to safety. Vince and Bear moved swiftly into the room, setting up a perimeter to cover their backs. The other bikers followed closely, keeping their eyes on the exits, ensuring no one would catch them off guard. Jack scanned the room, mentally mapping out the quickest way to free the children. His eyes locked on the locked cages. There were several ways to get in, but none of them were easy. He turned to Vince. Can you get those doors open? Vince nodded, pulling out a set of tools from his bag. I'll have them unlocked in a few seconds, he said. Jack's eyes darted to the door at the far end of the room. There was a sound, footsteps approaching. They're coming, Jack whispered. Vince and Bear exchanged quick looks before getting to work. Jack motioned for the others to take their positions. He needed to make sure the kids were safe and that they could get out of there fast. Every second counted. As the door creaked open, Jack's mind raced. This was it, the moment of truth. They were going to get the kids out, but it wasn't going to be easy. The men behind Project 48 wouldn't go down without a fight. The sound of boots on the concrete floor grew louder. Jack's fingers tightened around his gun as he watched the door. The men had arrived. They moved into the room, unaware of the biker's presence. Jack took a deep breath, waiting for the right moment. He counted to 3 in his mind. Then, in one fluid motion, he stepped forward, his gun aimed and ready. "Drop it," Jack shouted, his voice commanding. The men froze, their eyes widening in surprise. They hadn't expected to be caught. The bikers were on them in seconds, their guns drawn, ready to make their move. "You're not taking them," Jack said, his voice low but filled with authority. "This ends now." The men, realizing they were outnumbered, took a step back, their hands raised in surrender. Jack kept his gun aimed at them, not trusting them for a second. The rest of the bikers moved quickly, securing the area. "Get the kids out of here," Jack ordered. Vince was already unlocking the first cage, his fingers working quickly. The children stared at the bikers, unsure of what to do. "It's okay," Jack said gently, walking over to one of the children. "We're here to help you." Slowly, the children began to move toward the open cages, their faces filled with confusion but also a glimmer of hope. Bear and the others helped them, leading them to the exit. The group was almost free when a voice rang out behind them. "You think you've won?" One of the men snarled, his face twisted in anger. Jack turned, his eyes hardening. "This isn't over," the man continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You're in way over your head. We're not leaving without the kids," Jack said firmly. He motioned for the others to keep moving. "Let's go." As they made their way out of the mill, the children, now freed, walked alongside them, their faces still filled with fear, but with a new sense of freedom. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They had saved the kids, but the battle was far from over. The man's words echoed in his mind. "You're in way over your head." Jack didn't know who was behind Project 48, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop until they were all brought to justice. The bikers led the children to safety, making sure they were far away from the mill before they stopped to catch their breath. The cool night air filled their lungs as they gathered together, ready to take on whatever came next. Jack looked around at his crew, his resolve stronger than ever. "We're not done," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "This is just the beginning." The bikers knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were in this together. They had taken the first step towards stopping Project 48, and they weren't going to rest until every last piece of it was brought down. As they mounted their bikes and prepared to ride off into the night, Jack knew one thing for certain. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves. They were fighting for the children, for their future, and they wouldn't stop until they had won. The night was still, but the air was thick with anticipation. The bikers had made it out of the mill with the children, but Jack could feel the tension rising in the pit of his stomach. They had won a small victory, but the war was far from over. As they rode through the darkened streets, Jack's mind raced. They had no time to rest. The words of the man they'd captured in the warehouse haunted him. "You're in way over your head." Who was he? Who were the people behind Project 48? And why had they been using children for their twisted experiments? Jack glanced over his shoulder to see the little girl and her mother still riding behind him. They had made it out safely, but Jack knew they weren't out of danger yet. "We need to lay low," Jack said, his voice low but urgent. "Head to the old garage. It's the safest place we've got." Vince nodded in agreement, and the crew followed Jack's lead as they sped down a narrow road toward a dilapidated building hidden deep in the woods. The garage had been a sanctuary for the bikers for years, a place to lay low when things got too hot. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to regroup and plan their next move. As they arrived, Jack dismounted and immediately started directing the others. "Secure the perimeter," he said. "Keep the bikes hidden. We don't need anyone knowing we're here." Bear and Vince moved quickly, checking the surroundings and ensuring the area was secure. Jack turned to the woman and her daughter, who were now sitting on a nearby bench, their faces pale with exhaustion. Jack walked over and crouched down beside them. "You're safe now," he said softly. "But we're not done yet. There are people behind this, and we need to find out who they are." The woman nodded, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing her daughter's hand. "But who are these people? What do they want with my child?" Jack sighed, his gaze distant. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I will. I promise you, we'll make sure they pay for what they've done." He stood up, his eyes scanning the area. "Stay here. We'll be back as soon as we know more. Vince approached, holding a folder full of documents. We've got a lead, he said, his voice steady. I tracked down a few names from the papers we grabbed. One of them is tied to a company in the city. They've been linked to illegal biotech operations for years. This is bigger than we thought. Jack's eyes narrowed. A biotech company? That's where this all started. We need to get to the bottom of it. Vince nodded. I've already made contact with a few people who can help. We'll need to move fast, though. If they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll wipe out any evidence before we can get to it. Jack clenched his fists. We won't let that happen. We're taking them down, no matter the cost. The bikers gathered around Jack, their faces determined. They were ready for whatever came next. We'll hit them at their headquarters, Jack said, his voice cold with resolve. We get in, get the intel, and get out. No one's stopping us. The crew nodded, and they quickly began to make plans for their next move. The stakes were higher than ever, but they knew they couldn't turn back. As they prepared to leave, Jack took one last look at the woman and her daughter. They were safe for now, but Jack knew that the real danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the bikers mounted their bikes and revved their engines, the sound of their motorcycles echoed in the woods, breaking the stillness of the night. Jack led the way, his mind focused on the mission ahead. This wasn't just about saving the children anymore. This was about stopping a dangerous operation, one that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Jack pushed the throttle, the roar of his bike a reminder of the fight ahead. He wasn't going to stop until every last person responsible for Project 48 was brought to justice. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. As the group sped off into the night, Jack's determination grew stronger. They would expose the truth, and they would make sure no one else suffered because of it. The time for hiding was over. The fight for justice had begun. The night was still, but tension-filled. The air as Jack and his crew made their way through the winding roads, heading toward the biotech company that Vince had tracked down. Jack could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. They were close to finding out who was behind Project 48, and they couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The bikes roared through the streets, cutting through the darkness, as the headlights illuminated the path ahead. The woman and her daughter were safe for the moment, but Jack knew they couldn't let their guard down. Not with everything at stake. As they reached the outskirts of the city, the towering building of the biotech company loomed ahead. It was an imposing structure, with sharp angles and dark windows that seemed to watch them as they approached. Jack signaled for the group to stop. They parked their bikes in a nearby alley, out of sight. We'll approach from the back, Jack said, his voice low and focused. Vince, Bear, you're with me. The rest of you keep watch. The crew nodded, and they moved quietly toward the back entrance of the building. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest. This was it, the place where everything had started. The headquarters of the operation that had been manipulating and destroying lives for years. As they reached the door, Vince pulled out his tools and quickly went to work on the lock. Jack kept his eyes on the surroundings, his senses on high alert. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard now. The door clicked open, and they slipped inside. The interior of the building was sleek and sterile, the floors shining under the harsh fluorescent lights. Jack motioned for Vince and Bear to follow him as they moved through the hallway. The building was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. They were getting closer to the heart of this twisted operation. They reached a large, reinforced door at the end of the hall. Jack felt a surge of determination. This was the place where they would finally get the answers they had been searching for. Vince moved forward and began working on the door's lock. It took a few minutes, but eventually, they heard the satisfying click of the mechanism disengaging. With one last look around, Jack pushed the door open. Inside was a large, open room filled with computer screens and high-tech equipment. There were maps on the walls, and stacks of documents cluttered the tables. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. This was where the real work was being done, the place where the plans were put into motion. They weren't going to find all the answers here, but they could take something that would lead them to the next step. Vince moved to one of the computers and began typing quickly. Bear kept watch by the door. Jack walked over to a table covered in documents. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the information. As he read, his mind raced. He could see the connections now, the names, the locations, the operations that had been running under the radar for years. This was far bigger than he had ever imagined. The biotech company wasn't just involved in Project 48. They were connected to a network of criminal activities, from human trafficking to illegal experimentation. Jack clenched his fists, anger rising inside him. These people had to be stopped. As he was about to grab another file, a sound from the hallway caught his attention. The faint click of footsteps echoed in the distance. Jack turned to Vince. "They're coming," he said, his voice low. Vince quickly finished what he was doing and started transferring files from the computer. Bear moved to the door, his eyes alert. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they realize we're here," Bear said. Jack nodded. "Get the files, and let's go." The door at the far end of the room creaked open, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. A group of men stepped inside, their eyes immediately locking onto the bikers. "You're too late," one of the men said, a smug smile on his face. "You think you're going to stop this? You have no idea what you're up against." Jack's grip tightened around his gun. "We're here to make sure you pay for what you've done," he said, his voice cold. The men laughed, but Jack could see the fear in their eyes. They had underestimated the bikers. Jack motioned for Vince and Bear to take position. The fight was coming, and they needed to be ready. The men moved toward them, their hands reaching for their weapons. But the bikers were faster. In a flash, Jack and Bear were on the men, knocking them to the ground, disarming them with ease. Vince finished transferring the files and quickly joined the fight. The room was chaos as the bikers took down the remaining men. But there was still no sign of the mastermind behind it all. Jack knew they were getting closer, but they couldn't let their guard down. "Get the kids and get out of here," Jack shouted as he helped one of the men to his feet. "We've got what we need, but we need to move fast." The bikers began to clear the room, securing the files and getting ready to leave. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't finished yet. There was something more to this, something they hadn't uncovered. As the bikers made their way back toward the bikes, Jack's thoughts were a whirlwind. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The group of bikers sped through the empty roads, the roar of their engines drowning out the fading sound of the chaos they left behind. Jack's mind was still processing everything. What they had uncovered, the dangers they faced, and the lives they had saved. The files they had retrieved had confirmed what Jack already knew. Project 48 was only one part of a much larger operation, and they were only scratching the surface. But as they rode, a sense of urgency began to settle in. They couldn't let up now. Not when they were this close to unraveling everything. They reached the safe house on the outskirts of town, the same one they had used to hide out before. The air was heavy with tension as they parked their bikes. The woman and her daughter were still with them, but Jack could see the exhaustion in their eyes. They had been through hell, and Jack knew they needed rest, but there was no time for that. Not yet. Jack turned to Vince. "We've got the intel we need, but we're not done. We need to hit their main facility. We need to stop them for good." Vince nodded, his face grim. "I agree. This isn't over until we take them down. But we need to be smart about it. They're not going to just let us walk in." Jack's gaze hardened. "I'm not asking for a walk-in. We'll hit them hard, fast. We'll take them by surprise. And we won't leave until it's done." The bikers gathered around, their faces set in determination. They had made it this far, and they weren't backing down now. "We're going to end this," Jack said, his voice steady. "For the kids, for the families, for everyone they've hurt. We won't stop until they're all behind bars." With that, the bikers began to prepare for their final push. They packed up what they needed, making sure everything was in order. It was time to move out. Jack glanced over at the woman and her daughter one last time. The little girl, despite the fear still in her eyes, seemed to trust Jack. She had no choice but to, and Jack wasn't about to fail her. As they left the safe house and headed toward the facility, Jack felt the weight of the mission bearing down on him. This wasn't just about stopping a dangerous operation. This was about justice. It was about making sure that no one else suffered at the hands of people like this. They arrived at the facility just before dawn. The building was massive, sprawling across acres of land. It looked abandoned from the outside, but Jack knew better. This was it, the heart of the operation. They parked their bikes far enough away so they wouldn't be seen and approached on foot, moving stealthily toward the entrance. The perimeter was well guarded, but the bikers were used to this. They had trained for situations like this. Vince and Bear took the lead, scouting ahead while Jack and the others followed. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows. When they reached the entrance, they found a guard standing watch. Vince and Bear quickly subdued him, dragging his unconscious body out of sight. They continued inside, and Jack's senses were on high alert. They moved deeper into the building, finding more guards, more security systems, and more obstacles, but nothing could stop them. They pushed forward, determined to reach the heart of the operation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the main room. Inside, Jack saw a group of men gathered around a large table, looking over plans and maps. This was it. These were the men behind Project 48, the ones responsible for all the pain and suffering. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady. "It's over," he said, his gun aimed at the men. "You're finished." The men froze, their eyes wide with shock. They hadn't expected the bikers to find them, let alone catch them by surprise. "Who are you?" one of the men asked, his voice trembling. "We're the ones who are going to make sure you never hurt anyone again," Jack said, his voice cold as steel. "Now, put your hands up." The men complied, realizing they had no way out. Jack motioned for Vince and Bear to secure the room. As the bikers moved in to disarm the men, Jack found the files they had been looking for, the final pieces to the puzzle. He flipped through them quickly, scanning the documents. Everything was there. The names, the connections, the details of the entire operation. They had everything they needed to take down the entire network. But Jack wasn't done yet. He turned to the men. "You're going to answer for everything you've done," he said. "And when you're locked away, you'll never hurt anyone again." The men were silent, knowing there was nothing they could do. Jack gave a signal, and Vince immediately began calling for backup. They would take these men into custody and make sure the operation was fully dismantled. As the bikers made their way back to their bikes, Jack looked around one last time. This was it. They had done what they came here to do. The children they had saved, the lives they had changed, it was all worth it. And as they rode off into the rising sun, Jack knew that this battle was over. But the war for justice would never end. They had fought for what was right, and they had won. No one would ever forget the names of the bikers who brought down Project 48. Not as long as there was still work to be done. Hell Angel stories have always been filled with adrenaline, loyalty, and intense missions. In this gripping tale, a group of bikers embarks on a dangerous journey to uncover a dark secret behind an illegal operation. With their loyalty to one another and their commitment to justice, these riders become unlikely heroes, protecting a young girl and her mother from a sinister organization. As the bikers uncover hidden truths, they battle corrupt forces, facing impossible odds to stop a dangerous network that has been conducting illegal experiments on children. Hell Angel stories often showcase the resilience and courage of these fierce bikers, and this one is no different as they fight for survival and justice. From unexpected alliances to breathtaking action sequences, the bikers race against time to save innocent lives and bring the perpetrators to justice. As the story unfolds, the Hell Angels prove that their bond is unbreakable, and they will stop at nothing to protect the innocent. With the truth slowly unraveling and the fight intensifying, the bikers push forward with unwavering determination, knowing that the stakes are higher than ever. Hell Angel stories like this one highlight the raw emotion and determination of these legendary bikers as they face dark, corrupt powers. This story of bravery, sacrifice, and justice showcases what it truly means to fight for what's right, no matter the cost.